Hey everybody, welcome back to Book Club. Today I am thrilled to be joined by Matthew Norman, author of our Book of the Month, Grace and Henry's Holiday Movie Marathon. His warm, witty storytelling made this book such a joy to read, and I'm really excited to dive into it. So, welcome, Matthew, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. This is a pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about it because I felt like this was just like the perfect holiday book, but there was also so many things that really resonated for me in terms of the grief and how holidays aren't always the twinkly lights and just the happiness that we see reflected in traditional rom-coms. And because I feel like I would say, how would you describe this book, I guess? Is it a rom-com slash?
That's a really good question. My entire career, I have sort of just, straddled genres a little bit, popped in and out of one genre and gone to another. It's hard to say. I would say I'm comfortable calling it a romantic comedy, because I think it's at its core, it's a comedy. I think most of my books, I sort of go for that. I have a comedic lens as a writer, and then I just, set the stories kind of against that, and with Grace and Henry, some books arrive with plot, some books arrive with a sort of situation that you think might be a fun story to tell or whatever. But, with Grace and Henry, it arrived with these two characters who were going through this thing. And I kind of worked back from there. And I imagined, well, what would be a difficult thing for them to be dealing with, simultaneously. And then I stumbled upon the idea of the first holidays without their respective spouses. And then I was like, oh my God, I think I have to write a holiday book now, and I didn't even realize that there's a whole genre of holiday books. I mean, there's holiday romances, there's holiday mysteries, it's amazing. And I just sort of stumbled accidentally into this entire genre. So it's going great. I'm glad I did, but I almost didn't know that it existed, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm glad that you did too. What would you say inspired that thought process, the very beginning spark of it all?
Sure. I think that, I have two people in my life. One is an old friend, and one is sort of a new friend that I've met through another friend. And they've both lost their spouses way too young, like in their early 40s. And, one lost his spouse through a long illness, one lost her husband through an accident. And I think that their stories and watching what they were going through and this sort of journey that they were going on, uh, it just lived in my head for a couple of years, and I just kind of couldn't stop thinking about it. And I think that when you're a writer and you find yourself obsessing over the same thing for a couple of years, you have to sit down and write a book about it. And so their story was definitely the inspiration for sure.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine, but I feel like stepping into both Grace and Henry's inner worlds, you really explored grief in a way that wasn't just the sadness of it all. I guess what were you most interested in exploring by giving readers access to both of their perspectives?
I liked having both perspectives because, this is the first time in my six novels I've never given one of my female characters a first person point of view. And that was exciting for me. It was fun to do. And, even though I'm a male writer, obviously, Grace, I think, came to me the most easily. It took me longer to figure Henry out. And because I feel like she's kind of bombastic and she doesn't have as much interior monologue going on. She just sort of says what she's thinking, which, as a writer, that was really fun to write. So I loved having both characters in their own points of view, both suffering the same loss in a general sense, but in very different ways, and they were grieving in a different way. And of course, Grace has children, and I think that's an entirely different responsibility because when you're responsible for other people's lives, you have to compartmentalize your feelings, set them aside because the kids come first, right? And so I think that's the thing I was exploring is how Grace in particular would manage her family, raise her children, still invest in her own career while being followed around by this sort of cloud of sadness that is just inevitable when you lose a spouse.
For sure. I guess for readers who maybe haven't picked up the book yet, can you give maybe a general overview? I thought halfway, I was like, maybe that'd be a good thing to do. Like, will you explain a little bit about this book and what it's about?
Of course, yeah. So it's the most literal title I've ever written, which is probably a good thing. Grace and Henry's Holiday Movie Marathon, and it's about Grace and Henry, and they have both about 11 months ago or so lost their spouses in very different ways. One through an illness, and one suddenly in an accident, and they're coming upon the first holidays without their respective spouses, and uh, through their mothers or friends, and through their mother's meddling, they end up meeting under the guise of just sort of, oh, well, you guys should try to be friends, because nothing, nobody knows what you're going through except for you two. You have so much in common. And they sort of roll their eyes and begrudgingly decide that they'll be friends because, their mothers in this particular case are right. And so they develop a friendship, and part of that friendship is they watch classic holiday movies together. And each chapter is titled a different holiday movie. And when I say holiday movie, I'm talking about the most obvious classics you can imagine. I mean, it's, Elf, Love Actually, The Family Stone, Christmas Vacation, Home Alone, the really obvious ones. And which, sets grief and sadness kind of parallel with this very cheery, collectively happy time that is the holidays. And to me, that felt just like an interesting sort of dichotomy to write a book.
Yeah, no, there's so many things that you said that I am excited to dive into. But a lot of the readers were saying that the movie nights were one of their favorite parts of the book. And that feeling of being on the couch with Grace and Henry, watching those classic films that you talked about, where somewhere I felt like a little unconventional. At least for me, I didn't watch Edward Scissorhands growing up around the holidays, but maybe people do, and it's just me. But I thought that watching those films really mirrored what they were going through. So how did you approach choosing which movies to include in the story?
So when I first had the idea, I just loved it, right? I love the idea with the movies and all that because I love holiday movies. And so I wrote down a bunch that I knew I really wanted to get in there, movies that I had feelings about and I'd seen many, many times. Um, and what happened was I ran out of movies, right? That list, I needed more movies, especially after the first draft. My editor pointed out to me that there weren't enough movies. They didn't watch enough movies, and it wasn't Christmassy enough yet to sort of justify, the book, the hook of the book, and the title of the book. And so I had to do a bit of a deep dive and come up with new ones. And that is where, and you mentioned Edward Scissorhands. That's where Edward Scissorhands came from, because I was sort of racking my brain to think of not only holiday movies, but holiday movies that had a sort of meaning to them and could work as sort of plot devices and move Grace and Henry through, what they were dealing with. And I stumbled upon Edward Scissorhands. And you're right, it's not a traditional holiday movie. I mean, I'm not going to argue that it is, but a big significant scene in that movie takes place over the holidays while they're sort of decorating this big elaborate sort of Tim Burton tree, right? And I, I stumbled upon the idea that the characters in that book, Edward in particular, they're like a metaphor for Grace and Henry because they want to be together and they're sort of being drawn together, but they both have emotional scissors for hands and they're destined to hurt each other if they try to get into like an actual real relationship. And so, some of it was my own doing and knowing what I wanted to write, and some of it was just the happy accident of stumbling onto things. And I think the Edward Scissorhands scene is probably the most intimate scene between Grace and Henry. And another one was the Charlie Brown Christmas special. That one
Mhm.
came later too. And I think that gave them another intimate scene that might be my favorite scene in the entire book. They watch it over FaceTime together, which I thought was just a very intimate moment between the two. And it happens really early in their relationship. But yeah, so the movies really drove it, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of reminds me of what you mentioned about the classic Die Hard argument of if that's a Christmas movie or not. So I thought it was really fun to incorporate movies like Edward Scissorhands that I hadn't really thought of as Christmas movies, but then when you explain it, it's like, well, yeah, they could be.
Could be. Yeah.
I also thought it was really fun the way that their moms mommed them into that first meeting, like you talked about. It's really funny, but it's also a little excruciating. I was thinking of my mom in that situation. But it gets them talking. And so I guess how did you land on that being the way that Grace and Henry would first connect and were you trying to capture something in particular about family trying to help or maybe overstepping in the process?
Yeah, some things in a book when you're coming up with a book and outlining it and trying to figure out where to go, some things you have to agonize over and spend a long time. The mom's thing, I didn't. It just popped into my head. I was like, that is how they would meet because, my own mom is, I realize sometimes because we live kind of far away from each other. But I realize sometimes when I'll talk to her like once a week or so that she is always thinking about me. And she is always thinking about my brother. It's like we live in her head constantly. And when we have a problem, when one of us is bummed about something, she is sort of just dealing with that. And so I imagined grief spiraling through an entire family. And, the moms and the dads and the brothers and the sisters and the kids are all grieving in very different specific ways. And Grace and Henry's moms were grieving in the sense that they had this idea that they wanted somehow to try to fix it. And so I imagine they're them conniving sort of off screen because this never appears in the book, but them talking is like we should get them together. They have a lot in common, and they could make each other less sad. And so that's kind of what they do. And very early on, Grace and Henry, their meeting is just totally orchestrated and absurd, and they realize that they totally got mommed. They're like, oh, moms.
Yeah. No, like you said, those conversations that we're having off page, I totally pictured each one of them and the way that they were scheming because it is such a mom thing to do. And like you said, that fix it mentality. But I think, like I kind of started to say, as a reader, I feel like the way that you mixed the different shades of grief and the humor and the really tender moments was just really magical for me. And so I thought that I wanted to say the grief run where they shout out all the things that they hated at the moment and were struggling with. It kind of felt strangely joyful in the middle of all the pain. And so I was wondering if you were consciously aiming for that mix of release and humor throughout, or if you were surprised when you wrote that moment in particular or any of the moments in the book.
Yeah, I think that gets back a little bit earlier to just the idea of writing through a comedic lens. And so I'm always trying to find ways because all of my books are, comedies, but all of them deal with some degree of heavy stuff. This one a little more than some of the others. In my fourth book, there's a character in it who has terminal cancer and is dying throughout the entire book. So that's pretty heavy, but it is also a comedy. And so I feel like if you are funny and light at times, you can sort of ease the reader into talking about some of the most serious things imaginable. And that was a big challenge of the book, initially in like first draft mode was the tone. And, it's like there's sad stuff, there's really sad stuff, and then there's funny stuff, there's like slapstick comedy stuff almost at times. And I was like, am I trying too hard? Are these shifts tonally jarring? And then I realized that I just had to let the book be what it wanted to be. And I think it comes down to trusting the reader, and the reader understands that emotions are sophisticated. We've all been at a funeral, been very sad, and somebody has said something funny, and we've laughed. That sort of cathartic, almost crying laugh. And so I just kind of let it be, what it wanted to be, and trust the reader to make the make the move back and forth from happy to sad. And I hopefully it worked.
I think so, for sure. You said that it was Henry's perspective that was harder to write. Did you feel like writing those heavier moments was harder than writing the humorous ones, or vice versa?
Yeah, the harder the because I feel like dialogue and comedy and a sort of breeziness just sort of come easily to me as a writer, and that's why I think I do lean on them quite a bit. My books tend to be about, have a lot of funny stuff in them, and they're also very dialogue heavy. But it was the more introspective stuff, the sadder things, that it's just more difficult to write because you have to kind of emotionally take yourself there, and you have to like bring yourself down. It's like, okay, how am I going to get through this? And how would I set myself up emotionally to sort of empathize with the kind of sadness required to write a scene like this? And because when you write a book, I mean, you're with those people in that situation every day, for like 2 years. And so you kind of go through it with them. And The easy stuff and the funny stuff was sort of a break for me. It's like, oh, today's a funny one. But it can be difficult for sure.
No, that makes sense. I feel like one of my favorite threads in the book is Henry helping Grace's son Ian with his school art contest. That was something that I thought was a really nice, light, just gentle thing that's going on amidst all of the pain that they were both going through, all going through. So, how did that dynamic between Henry and Ian come about?
So I love having kids in my books. I have kids myself. I have two daughters, and they're older now. They're like 16 and 14, so they're obviously teenagers. But I've enjoyed sort of observing them from babyhood to toddlerhood to little kid to now being teenagers. And so I love having kids in my writing because they can be truth tellers. They can say things that adults wouldn't say. And so I always knew I wanted them to be there. And I imagined their motivations would be very clear. Like uh, Ian would, whether he could articulate it or not, had just lost the father figure in his life and would be looking maybe to replace that. So he's sort of reaching out for like a male figure in his life. And Bella's having the opposite reaction, the younger daughter, where she just is rejecting Henry. And so setting up that balance I thought was interesting because one kid is sort of reaching out and one kid is kind of rejecting him. And I imagine because Henry doesn't have kids of his own. And so I imagine that him sort of falling in love with Grace was more a product of him falling in love with the family, the security of the family, because he really is, on an island by himself in a lot of ways in his little sad apartment trying to move on with his life, right? And so he just kind of falls in love with the warm embrace of this messy little sad family.
For sure. I feel like as Grace and Henry grow closer, there's this question of whether it's the loneliness and the shared trauma or really genuine connection and hope for the future that pulls them together. And I guess how much did you plan the trajectory of their relationship from grief companions to potential lovers?
Yeah, I think that they're both, there's a couple of times in the book they both talk about that. It's like, they don't say this specifically, but it's like, do we even like each other, or do we just are we just sharing this sort of experience together? And I thought that was, in a romance or romantic comedy, you have to set up obstacles for your couple. And that was their big obstacle. That was sort of in their own heads. And then I set up real obstacles in the form of other human beings that kind of wander in and potential other love interests that at least on paper might be better suited for each of them. But yeah, no, that was a big thing. And I think that people uh, who lose spouses, too young, like these two, I think they're constantly asking themselves that question. Am I just trying to fill this hole in my life, or do I actually like this person? And I think that sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. It's like it depends on the person and the relationship and, if they're ready.
Oh gosh, I feel like there's so much I want to talk to you about. I want to pull out a little bit broader and ask you about your craft and how you structure and your process. So, do you outline your novels or do you prefer to discover the story as you go? I just can't speak today.
Talking is hard, I know. It's the holidays. I think we're all kind of in our
Yeah.
days. But no, I'm the perfect writer to ask this question to because I've done both. So I have
Mm.
six novels. The first three novels I did not outline. I had sort of a vague note card system. Actually, I still kind of use note cards. This is for the next book I'm writing. But um, so I would write down just basic plot point ideas, put them on this board that's behind me, and just sort of look at it. And that would be sort of the rough plot of the book. And then, other than that, I would just wake up every day and just go on vibes and chaos, right? And so those three books took consequently years for me to write, right? I just would write down blind alleys. And I think the books turned out good. I mean, I like them all, but they were a struggle to write, frankly. And somewhere after my third book, I was like, I got to change this. I mean, I have to actually write books every couple of years as opposed to every 5 years. And so I started really formally outlining. And it can be painful at times because it doesn't feel like writing. It's a lot of just sort of staring and thinking and jotting with a marker down, like, will they get in a fight here? Whatever. But that really helps me lay out the map, right? The map for the story. And then that way, every day when I show up at the computer, I sort of know what I'm doing that day. I know what I'm working on. And consequently, the books, I'm now on like a every 2 year sort of publishing cycle. So I'm writing the books much quicker. I don't know if they're better books, but I know that they are written in a more organized, efficient way. And so I'm a big proponent of outlining, for sure.
That makes sense. I'm curious what role then revision plays in your process and how that's changed from the books that you pantsed. I feel like I only recently learned what pantsed and plotting is. Like I knew plotting, but I was like, what exactly is
Pants.
pantsing?
Fly by the seat of your pants. Yep.
Yeah. But how did the revision process change for you between books?
So I think the revision process has not particularly changed. Because whether you're a pantser or a plotter, really all you're doing is trying to get to a first draft, and once you get to the first draft, that's when you are really getting to work. You're looking at the book as a whole and seeing what does and doesn't work. And so that hasn't changed. I think that the editing process has been about the same amount of time and effort with each one. It's just those first three first drafts took a lot longer and more agonizing, and there were a lot more emotional breakdowns, But and I just gather feedback from my editor and my agent and a couple of writing friends. I think with each book, there's a subject matter that I don't know enough about to totally trust myself, and so I give an early draft to somebody and who I feel like is an expert at that particular subject, whether it's like the financial industry or my fifth book is about a musician, so I gave it to a very musically minded person just to help me out, and so I get feedback from them just about stuff that's right and wrong, but yeah, but then I gather all the feedback and just spend about a year usually just breaking the book apart, really leaning into the stuff that works, cutting the stuff that doesn't work, and filling it back up with stuff that hopefully works, so it's but yeah, I think my ultimate advice, whether you're a pantser or a plotter, get to the first draft of a book as quickly as you can, because that's when you have something to work with. That's when you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that's when the real work kind of begins. The real writing, the real art is in the editing.
That's great advice, and I always enjoy hearing about that. Do you feel like you're one of the writers who really enjoys editing? I feel like people either love it or they hate it.
Yeah, I do like it. I mean, I think that there's different types of editing. So there's like the story editing, the artistic side of editing, I really like, breaking things down and what works and talking to, my editors have always just been fantastic and so smart, and they say the most amazing things, and then that sends you off in a different exciting direction maybe you wouldn't have gotten on yourself. But then there's also the very, very tactical line editing. It's like, comma, that kind of thing. And that's not fun. I mean, that's just busy work, like I usually just listen to music and just sort of just get through it, mark, change the dumb mistakes. So that's not exactly fun, but it's part of the process.
With all the different directions that you could take the book, how do you know when it's done? Like what to you says, okay, this is how I wanted it to be. It's finished.
When I was in grad school, one of my professors, a writer named Richard Bausch, said that when you find yourself messing with punctuation or switching the subject and predicate of a sentence, you're done. Like
Mhm.
when you're no longer taking big swings at something, making large scale changes, agonizing over large scale changes. When you find yourself very micro, that's when you're done. That's when it needs to go to somebody else. It needs to be done. And I've followed that too. The smaller the changes and the obsessions are, the more likely that it's done.
Okay. I'm curious then what is your education in writing and what I guess what is your creative journey to where you are today?
Yeah, so I was one of those writers who discovered that I wanted to be a writer very young, like when I was 6 years old, and I would write little stories and read them to my parents. So I always wanted to be a writer, but I knew enough to know that you don't get paid for wanting to be a writer. You can't, have a career as a wannabe writer. And so I decided to, through the help of my dad, actually, it was his advice, was I got a job in advertising. And so I was an advertising major in college and an English double minor. So I took all these writing classes and these lit classes. Um, but I got a degree in something I could get a job in. And so I worked in advertising for about 20 years, and it was great. It was a good job. I was able to live and pay for things and all that. So I never had the starving artist sort of journey toward publication. I just had a job, and I would write at night and on weekends. When I was younger, I couldn't do that now. It was exhausting. But yeah, so I sold my first couple of books while I was working, three books when I was working in advertising. And when I sold my fourth, I decided, I talked to my wife about it, and we decided it was time to just, leave corporate America behind and focus full time on writing. And it's been great. So yeah. Oh, and I got an MFA also, as I mentioned. I have a master's in creative writing that I got at George Mason in the DC area.
Oh, cool. Did you have a favorite class in any of your studies that you would recommend to someone who could maybe just take a one-off or research more about that particular subject?
Totally. I was one of those MFA students who absolutely loved being an MFA student. I loved all of the classes. They were fantastic. I met a lot of writers when I was there. A lot of the fellow students would complain about certain things, or I was just so happy to be there because I had never been in such a writerly environment before, surrounded by so many writers. Because I had, I was an advertising major. I had a job in advertising, and when I showed up that first day for my MFA, I was like, "These are my people! Oh my God, these are book people! This is amazing." My favorite class, though, I took it twice actually. It was called scene writing. And the idea was, it was over the summer, and the idea was that you could have no exposition. You could have no narration. It was all basically, it was almost like a screenwriting class, but it was just all dialogue and all mood and like all vibes, right? And you could describe maybe what somebody looked like, but you couldn't just do these big chunk paragraphs of backstory and stuff like that. And the each day, so we'd get a writing assignment each night, write something, and then we would read it aloud to the whole class the next day. And if we started to do like exposition and narration, our professor Alan Shoes would stop us. And it was so stressful, but it was so. I think about Alan Shoes. His name was Alan Shoes. He's a writer. He's no longer with us, but I think about his big booming voice all the time in my head when I'm writing, because I'm like, this shouldn't be a big chunk paragraph of gray words. This should be two characters talking about this. And so I think about that class all the time. And I asked Alan if I could take it again the following summer, and he was like, "You're an MFA student. You can do whatever you want." So I took it a second time, just for fun because I liked it so much.
Yeah, I had made a note when I was reading that I felt like the scenes felt really cinematic, almost like we were watching a holiday movie with Grace and Henry while they were watching theirs. That was a really cool quality for the book to have. That kind of takes me into what I was hoping to ask you about, because I don't think I've ever talked to anyone about this before, but the audiobook for your book was incredible. And so I was curious how involved you were in the process of selecting the narrators and kind of bringing the book to life in that way.
I tell you, of all of my books, they've all had audio versions, right? This is the one that everybody talks about and everybody has asked me about. And I get tagged constantly online about people complimenting the voice narrators. And so this is great. It's so exciting that people are engaging the book that way and they love it. So I'm involved, but I don't have, it's similar to the cover of the book. Like I don't have absolute yes or no authority, but I'm just one of the voices that kind of gets to decide what we think about the cover, and about the voice folks. And when it was time to do the voice, the audiobook, the audio folks at Penguin Random House sent me a bunch of female voice actors, and I thought, well, they're great, but what if it was both? What if, because it's they both have first person, narration in the book. What if we did both? And they like that idea. And so then they came up with the kind of back and forth that it ends up being. And so there's a male and a female voice performers, and they do an absolutely wonderful job. And they're really performing the book for the listener. And I think it's a whole different experience. You know, I'm not a big audiobook person because I just love reading so much, but it is a different experience. It is like watching or listening to a performance of the book for sure.
Yeah, it is. I feel the same way. I usually like the physical copy in my hands, but I'd heard so much about the audiobook and I was blown away. When you get that lineup of narrators to hear and kind of give your opinion on what qualities are you looking for in the voices, especially the ones portraying Grace and Henry?
It's hard to describe because in my head, I everything sounds really kind of monotone. You know who the actor David Duchovny is? I always imagine a sort of monotone David Duchovny voice, which is not practical or you know what I'm saying? That's not how it should be, but that's just how it sounds in my head, you know?
Yeah.
And so I have to take that and realize that what I'm thinking is not correct. Like that is not the answer, right? And I need to trust the people who know audiobooks, right? And so they send me and I listen, they send me the clips and I listen and just I kind of go on vibes, you know, like who feels this person feels right. And and sometimes there's practicality stuff. Like in the book before this, my fifth book, there's a British character, so the person had to be able to do a British accent. There's some practical stuff like that that sometimes will weigh in, but with these two, there's nothing like that. You know, it's just who feels like Grace, who feels like Henry, and I think both just landed perfectly.
Yeah. Were there any I guess, was there anything in the recording process that prompted you to see a scene or emotional beat or even one of the characters differently in the audio and anything that stood out to you in a new way listening to it?
Not really. I haven't listened to the entire thing. I will admit that because that's quite an investment, and also it is weird to listen to people reading your own writing. It's very weird. It's a
Yeah.
it's a strange experience. So I haven't listened to all of it, but I love how the female voice performers handled the kids. You know, because she she modulates her voice a little and changes her voice for when she's from the kid when she's giving the kids dialogue, but not so much that it's distracting or overly cutesy or weird or whatever. It just flows very nicely. So I love the way that she in particular handled the kids.
Yeah, no, I agree. I thought all around it was incredible, and such a cool experience to have with a book. So I really appreciate you sharing more about the audiobook because I just thought it was really cool. And I love like getting into the nitty-gritty of it. So I guess I had a couple just for fun questions about, the holiday movies and traditions. Do you have an all-time favorite holiday movie? And is it one of the ones in the book?
Yes, I have. I think I have a bunch. Like I have this sort of Mount Rushmore of holiday movies in my head that I love, but I think my favorite is Christmas Vacation because it's just so funny and sweet. And I really lean generally on just comedies, holiday comedies in particular. So I love Elf. I love the ones where you're just sort of laughing out loud and quoting along, and 8-year-olds can watch it, and also 75-year-olds can watch it and enjoy it. But I think Christmas, we kicked off our own little holiday movie marathon here at the house, my kids and I and my wife, with Christmas Vacation last week, and we were just quoting along the whole time. I was quoting along the whole time, and they told me to stop quoting along the whole time because I guess that's very irritating. But yeah, we had a fun time. But and Love Actually is in there too. I really like that movie, and I fully acknowledge that a lot of it hasn't aged terribly well. But I still love it. Those Colin Firth scenes in particular, I really like.
Is the holiday movie marathon, is that a tradition of your own that you put into the book?
Kind of. I mean, it's not a formalized thing. It's just I love them and my wife likes them too, or at the very least tolerates them. And so I just like having them on. You know, like you're decorating the tree, why not put a movie on? It's a random Tuesday after dinner. Nobody has anything going on. Let's watch Love Actually again for the 40th time, you know. So it is something that I really like. Getting everybody in my house to literally sit down on the couch and stare at a TV for 2 hours can be tough. So it's almost like music, you know, how music is just playing in the background. We have holiday movies playing kind of in the background as we're going about our daily lives, pretty much for like about 5 weeks straight here at my house.
No, I think that's amazing. That's so fun. Grace's children loved this snack called popcorn fish. If if anyone reading the book wanted to host their own holiday movie marathon, what snack do you feel like is kind of a non-negotiable to have?
Well, popcorn fish is good, and I totally made it up. People have asked me, it's like, did you love that as a kid? I'm like, no, I just completely made it up on the spot. It just seemed like something that a kid would come up with, and then just the family would be like, oh, well, this actually is good, and then the little kid would be like, put M&Ms in it, you know. But yeah, so I think concocting popcorn fish would be good with the addition of M&Ms. And yeah, M&Ms obviously makes everything better. You can put M&Ms on a steak and it would be better. But yeah, so I think that is good, and I do think that especially the holiday comedies are aided by any sort of alcohol, not for the children, but for the adults. So I'm a big fan of holiday drinking. I try to stay. Yeah, I'm nearly 50 years old now, so I'm trying to cut back on alcohol as much as I can, right? But in December, it's like whatever. I'll stop drinking in January, you know. So yeah.
Is it like the spiked eggnog, or is there any kind of like specific thing that you're like, this is my jam during the holidays?
So a few years ago, when the kids were much younger, we had an au pair from Germany named Anne. And she made this German, like mulled wine, it was called, where it was like
Mhm.
hot wine. And it was so good. And everybody in my family was horrified by it. But me, I was just like, bring it on. So she'd make this giant thing, and I would just be, just slamming it back. But yeah, so mulled wine and spiked eggnog, I really like a lot, which is another thing that my whole family's horrified by it. I'm not that I'd be giving my kids spiked eggnog, but just eggnog in general. They're like, it's gross, it's too thick or whatever. But yeah, I'm like, shut up. It's December. I'll drink whatever I want.
No, for sure. I can get behind the mulled wine. I've had that before, and it is very good. It's different, but it's good. Eggnog though, I can't get over the eggs in it. It because it is like a raw egg
Yeah,
in milk, right? Yeah. I just have a thing with
yeah.
eggs, I think, but definitely
Totally
the mulled
fair.
wine.
Totally fair. Yeah, the mulled wine is good because I feel like it is best consumed outside when it's really cold, like the Germans or whatever. Yeah, they'd be like, "It's cold, let's make this." Because if you drink it inside, you have to like go put a swimsuit on. You just warms your entire body up. So it'll definitely warm me up for sure.
I wanted to ask if there was anything else for book club readers or just anyone reading the book that you hope to impart on them and wanted them to know.
So there is a subplot that we haven't talked about involving mice. And
Yeah.
yeah, so it runs throughout almost the entire book. And Grace has a very minor, pretty adorable little mouse infestation in her house. And Henry tries to help her deal with that. And it kind of becomes a metaphor, not to be too Englishy, classy on this, but it becomes sort of a metaphor for the entire situation. And Henry goes to the hardware store and finds these things called humane traps, where you basically trap the mice without hurting them, then you just sort of have to deal with them, right? That is probably the only really autobiographical thing in the book that I can
Mm.
truly point to that happened to me. So when I was in my early 20s, I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and it gets very, very cold in the winter there. And my friend Ryan and I lived in this little house together. And the first winter there, mice showed up, right, as they do, because they're looking for a place to be, right? And we had that experience. We were like, we didn't have tons of them. It wasn't like a horror movie. It's just like occasionally one would pop in the kitchen and look at us and wave and run away. And we were like, oh my God, he's so cute. These mice are adorable. And we called our landlord and he's like, well, I'll bring over the traps. And we're like, no, wait a minute, the traps? You're going to like, kill them? And the guy was like, yeah, we're going to kill them. But I was like, well, we can't have that. So I went and got humane traps. And then I had to deal with just a big box full of mice. So that's the only real autobiographical part of the book is the little mice, the mouse thread. So I think as people are reading that, just know that that really happened.
Did you actually put them into the aquarium and keep them until the spring, or that piece was not a part of it?
That piece was not a part of it. I think that would have been the behavior maybe of a crazy person. But yeah, but I did have to. I would keep them in the cage for a bit, right? And then I would, on like a particularly warm day when the weather would, get a little bit warmer, I would go to a field and let them go. And I would just be like, goodbye, mice. Good luck to you. And I would sort of remove from my mind that like maybe tomorrow it was going to be 17 degrees or whatever. But yeah, so I had that. I went through the emotional gamut with mice. I think it was about 26 years ago when I was dealing with them in my previous life in Omaha.
Oh my gosh, no, that's so fun to hear. I really appreciate you jumping on to talk to me today and sharing all these things. And I'm really excited to talk more about it in book club and hear everybody's reactions to these stories.
Of course, no, this was my pleasure. I love this is my favorite thing to do is talking about books, so it was a good time.